talk today is from Michelle Lancaster from the Human Tissue Authority. Thank you so much for coming, Michelle. We really appreciate it. Just a little quick intro to Michelle. Michelle trained as an anatomical pathology technologist in 1995. She then worked in several mortuaries across England until 2008, when she became Mortuary and Bereavement Service Manager for a trust in the northeast of England. Having to be compliant with the HTA standards in the post-mortem sector for the majority of her working life, she was delighted to join the HTA in 2019 as a regulation manager. Michelle is now a member of both the Post-Mortem and Public Guidance on Compliance with the Human Tissue Act 2004 and the Codes of Practice. She also has too many cats and is enjoying to play the piano. Welcome, Michelle. I'm really looking forward
to you. Thank you, everyone. I'm just lovely. Right, well, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for letting me be here, Laura. It's really helpful. I thought what we'd do today is just go over who the Human Tissue Authority are. As you'd said, there's obviously a lot of new members to your group, who we are, what we do, and how we regulate material of human origin that is placed on public display, largely by museums, but also by other smaller institutions. So with that said, who are we? So the Human Tissue Authority, we're actually an independent regulator of organisations that remove, store and use human tissue for research, medical treatment, post-mortem examination, education and training, and display in public. We also actually give approval for organ and bone marrow donations from living people. And I'm actually also a member of our living organ donation assessment team. So we're quite a varied and wide-reaching organisation. There's probably only around 50 of us actually working within the organisation. So we're a very small arm's length body. However, we do have sort of a big impact on sort of organisations that are using material of human origin. So we were created by Parliament as a non-departmental public body, otherwise known as an arm's length body, of the Department of Health and Social Care. And we're overseen by an authority of lay and professional members which have been appointed by the government. So the Human Tissue Act 2004, which was updated as a result of sort of concerns that had been raised in the late sort of 1990s, early 2000s about the unconsented use of human material. And it came about largely from the post-mortem sector. So that was the sector I was actually from. And the Human Tissue Act, when it was updated, it actually came into force on the 1st of September 2006. And actually in the Human Tissue Act, it created the Human Tissue Authority and obviously the authority members. So whilst there are 50 of us working within the Human Tissue Authority, there are 12 authority board members which oversee our activity. What we do is we actually monitor, inspect, and we regulate organisations where licensable activities take place under the Human Tissue Authority. We also publish reports on what we find. And one of the things I've done here is under Find an Establishment, I've actually linked to all our public display sector establishments. So if you were interested in finding out who we currently license, then that's a link that you can use. The public display sector is actually our smallest sector. Our largest sector is the research sector, and public display, we currently only have 13 organisations which are licensed to display material of human origin in public. And I'll get on to why it's quite a small sector a little bit later on in the presentation. Following that, it's our post-mortem sector and also our human application sector. So that's any material that may be removed and then used for medical treatment in other humans. When we do license and inspect, where we find shortfalls, we always try and work with our organisations to ensure that improvements are made against an action plan. And again, I've got a little bit about inspections later on in the presentation. One of the things that needs to be done to obtain a licence to display material in public, if there is a requirement to do so, so applicants must demonstrate that where the premises, where the activity of the public display will take place, that they're suitable, and that they've got a designated individual, so somebody who is responsible, and it's a statutory legal responsibility to supervise the activity and the premises and the people working under the license to ensure that there's oversight and care of the remains that are displayed. As part of the application process, we always assess whether the establishment can meet a number of licensing standards. And in the public display sector, there's actually 36 individual standards in total. So we look at when an application is received as to whether an establishment actually meets our 36 individual standards or the ones that are applicable to their organisation, and we assess and determine whether a licence can be granted. The standards themselves, they reinforce the Human Tissue Act. So they're sort of underpinning what the Human Tissue Act is saying, and its intention that consent is paramount in relation to activities involving the removal, storage and use of human tissue. And that bodies of the deceased and organs and tissue removed from bodies are treated with respect, and that the dignity of the person, whether they're living or deceased, is maintained. We always work with our establishments, and we have a series of inspections currently ongoing within our 13 licensed establishments. And we work with them through the inspection process to help comply with the standards. Our standards are grouped under 4 headings. The first one, and the underpinning sort of standard of the Human Tissue Act, is about consent. So we will look at sort of consent policies that are in place, how people are receiving consent, if applicable, for the display of material of human origin. We also look at governance and quality systems of the establishment. We look at traceability, and especially where establishments may have large collections, which are sometimes on display, sometimes they're removed from display, sometimes they're loaned to other establishments. We look at how the traceability of collections is managed as well. And we also look at the premises, facilities and equipment. Under each of these headings, that's where our 36 standards then come from, and they flow from the overarching headings. So this is some links here to 2 very important documents for our public display sector. The first one is the Code of Practice D, which is public display, which details sort of in more detail than what I'm going to be explaining today, sort of what public display is, what it isn't, and what you need to do to be compliant with the Human Tissue Act. And then we've also got our HTA Code of Practice D, which is the public display standards and guidance. So that is where our 36 overarching standards and the guidance to meet the standards are actually held. So what actually is public display? So the definition of public display from the Human Tissue Authority point of view is it's an exhibition or display in which the body of a person or relevant material which has come from the body of a person is used for the purpose of being exposed to view by the public. When it comes to the public display sector, obviously consent is paramount. There are times when there are exceptions to when consent is required. So just to give a brief overview of this. So consent is required to publicly display tissue from the living, and that is usually consent from the person concerned. There are two aspects to the Human Tissue Act. So there are the consent requirements and there are also the licensing requirements. And both of them are slightly sort of different, but hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand when consent is required and when licensing is required. So as I just said, tissue from the living, this is where the person is alive. You need their consent to display their material. And a person with parental responsibility can consent for a child in some circumstances. When it comes to tissue from the deceased, where the person has died, their consent prior to death must be in writing and signed by the person or at their direction and in the presence of at least one witness who would test the signature, or it's contained within a legally stated will. And a person with parental responsibility cannot consent to use deceased child's tissue if there is no consent that was already in place from the deceased child prior to their death. So it's a bit different because some of our other sectors, you know, people can actually consent to the use of material sort of after somebody's death. And that's quite relevant in sort of, for example, our postmortem and research sectors. So those who are in the highest qualifying relationship with the deceased can actually consent to the use of the deceased person's material in the presence of there was no objection to the person in life or they hadn't nominated somebody to act on their behalf. But with the public display sector and also with our anatomy sector, so that's where the deceased may have donated their body to be used for an anatomical examination by medical schools, the person's consent in life must be written or contained in a legally stated will. There are some exemptions to when consent is not required, and this relates to existing holdings. So the Human Tissue Act, when it came into force, it's actually not retrospective. So any material that was stored for use for a scheduled purpose prior to the 1st of September 2006 can actually be used for a scheduled purpose under the Act without consent. And imported tissue. Now, this is quite a sensitive area because whilst there is no legal consent requirements to have consent in place for imported material, we have updated our codes of practice in the recent years because there are now expectations and good practice which are set out in the codes, which I'll just move on to. So this is uplifted from our Code of Practice D from the recent update. And this is about given the importance of consent and its role in maintaining public confidence in the use of human bodies and body parts, the HTA considers that the same consent expectations should apply for imported bodies and body parts. As for such materials sourced domestically within England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, unless the HTA is satisfied that there are exceptional circumstances for not doing so. So our expectation now is that if bodies, body parts, tissue, etc., are imported for the use and purpose of public display, that the same consent requirements are in place, which is the person's consent in life or in a will. Now, what the second part of the talk is about the licensing. So that covered sort of when consent was required for the display of material of human origin. When it comes to licensing, anywhere that wants to use material of human origin to place onto public display, In some circumstances, a licence will be required from the Human Tissue Authority to allow that activity to proceed. And the licensed activities would be the storage of a body or a deceased person or relevant material from which has come from a human body for use for a scheduled purpose. So that means if you are storing sort of material of human origin and you intend to use it for a scheduled purpose, that you then would need a license for storage of that relevant material. If you're planning to display it, then you would need a license for use for the purpose of public display of the body of a deceased person or relevant material which was come from the body of a deceased person. Again, there are exemptions to the licensing requirements under the Human Tissue Act. And this is tissue from the living for use for public display. The only thing that you need if you're actually displaying tissue from the living is their consent to do so. You do not need to be licensed if the tissue is actually from somebody who's given their consent for its use. In relation to the deceased, any material over 100 years old. So the legislative requirements of the Human Tissue Act do not apply to bodies or relevant material if more than 100 years have elapsed since the date of the person's death. Consent is not, therefore, required for the public display of bodies or human material over 100 years old, nor is a licence required. Just to clarify those points, for material over 100 years old, a licence and consent is not required for its use. So a lot of establishments do display material over 100 years old, and a lot of this is archaeological, and that's why we only have 13 current establishments which are licensed with us, because those establishments are actually displaying material that is less than 100 years old, or there may be no evidence that it is less than 100 years old in some circumstances where it's just on that cusp of is it not over 100 years. So if establishments are storing material that's less than 100 years old, but prior to the implementation of the Human Tissue Act, they do not need consent to display the material. However, they do need a license. Anybody displaying material that's after the implementation of the Human Tissue Act would need a license and would need the person's consent in life to the display of that material. So some of the key considerations for our regulation of the public display sector is looking at, obviously, first and foremost, is the consent provisions and whether they actually apply to the activity undertaken. The respect of the remains that are actually on public display, and obviously the dignity of how the displays are presented to the public. We also expect establishments would warn sort of visitors that they will encounter material of human origin, as there are sometimes some religious and sometimes some personal reasons that people may not want to, sort of come into contact with those kinds of displays. We also have obviously our licensing and inspection regime, which has been underway. We usually inspect our licensed establishments sort of every 2 to 3 years. And it's always a pleasure to go on site. And we've started moving sometimes as well to sort of virtual assessments. A lot of our establishments have static displays. So these are displays that have been in place for many years. And where we have been out on site in the last 2 or 3 years, we may decide to hold our next inspection like through a virtual assessment where we just discuss the 36 standards, especially if there's been, sort of no change in what is actually on display. The Human Tissue Authority, we've also got a legal remit under the Human Tissue Act to provide advice and guidance. And we provide that advice and guidance in a number of ways. And this is through our codes of practice, which are reviewed and updated when required. We've also got the HTA website, and I've got a slide at the end of the talk, which links to sort of where you can find out more information. We also have publications, and we provide sort of like direct advice and newsletters to our licensed establishments. Even if you're not licensed by the Human Tissue Authority, you can still sign up to our newsletter and be kept up to date with what's going on in our various sectors. And we also hold stakeholder engagement forums. And we had one recently with our licensed establishments. I think it was in October, the end of October, where the designated individuals, the people who were responsible for oversight of the activity, that we all get together with the Human Tissue Authority, the designated individuals, and discuss sort of regulation, if there's any advice and guidance that the sector needs, if there's anything upcoming that we should be aware about, which would help sort of focus where our engagement should be. With our licensing and inspection, so just a quick whistle-stop tour of what we do. So when I'm preparing for an inspection of an establishment under the public display sector, what we're looking at is we're looking at the suitability of the premises, practices, and the designated individual. So we make sure that that person is still suitable to oversee the activities. We look at the licensing standards, so the 36 standards under the overarching standards. So with consent, what we're looking for, so establishments meeting the consent standards will be able to demonstrate that their processes for seeking and gaining consent comply with the Human Tissue Act and our codes of practice. The standards also cover the documentation and information used to support the establishment's consent procedures. So that's, for example, if they're providing information to those wanting to give consent. There are some people who do approach the Human Tissue Authority who say that they would like to donate their body or body parts for the use in public display after their death. So we usually give them advice and guidance on how to do that. If establishments are accepting sort of requests for donation of individuals' bodies after death, we would just expect that they have a sort of information leaflets and consent procedures in place that ensure that, you know, the person who's given consent, that their consent in life has been fully documented and they understand exactly what they're actually consenting to. We also expect that any staff involved in the consent-seeking procedures, that they've been actually trained in how to take consent under the Human Tissue Act, and that they're actually equipped for dealing with the sensitive nature of the task. In relation to governance and quality systems, establishments who meet this standard will be able to demonstrate that they have suitable governance framework. It's underpinned by clear and controlled documentation. They have got effective systems of audit and staff training and well-organised record keeping. In addition, they will have effective system of risk management and suitable systems to deal with any adverse events. So, for example, with risk assessments and with dealing with adverse events, what we're looking for is making sure that establishments have got risk assessments in place which cover sort of how material of human origin will be handled in the event of sort of a fire, a flood, security breaches, for example. And in relation to traceability, we're looking for establishments, when they meet the standards, they will be able to demonstrate that from receipt of material of human origin to final disposal or disposition, that they've got traceability records or for the material right the way throughout the history of this specimen. We usually test the traceability. We actually undertake audits. So, for example, in a museum collection, we may look at the records, the acquisition, sort of the material, where it is actually located, and that there is actually sort of a system in place that allows staff to understand and to be able to locate items should they need to, especially if people have got large collections which are in storage. Just make sure that the governance of those collections is in place. In addition, as the final traceability step, they will have established any disposal arrangements which are in accordance with the Human Tissue Authority's Code of Practice. So, for example, if an establishment, and we've had one about a year or two ago, they were actually displaying a brain of an individual with consent, and they felt that this had come to its end of its natural display life, and they sort of deaccessioned the brain from display, and it was actually sent for sensitive disposal. So we would expect to see that those records right the way from the acquisition to the disposal date if needed. So with premises, facilities and equipment, these establishments meeting these standards, we need to see that the premises are actually suitable for the activities taking place, that they're secure, that security and obviously is paramount to ensure the dignity of the remains that are on display, and that they're clean and that they're controlled. So if there are remains that need to be stored at specific temperatures, that is in place. Also that they have sort of any ongoing monitoring to ensure that all key quality specifications are maintained. And we also cover the equipment that's used to make sure that any equipment used in the display is suitable and it doesn't present an impediment to the staff using it. So, for example, if items are in display cases and they need to be monitored, temperature controlled, or they need to be cleaned, that sort of the staff have necessary access that they can undertake, so they're routine maintenance duties without being impeded by sort of the equipment that's in place to do that. That is pretty much a quick whistle-stop tour of who we are and what we do. Please do come and visit us at thehta.gov.uk. We do have a newsletter for professionals, as stated, and there is a link there to our newsletter. We are also on Twitter at HTA_UK, and we're also on LinkedIn and Facebook. Thank you. Any questions?
You're muted, Laura.
I think you're still on mute, Laura. Sorry.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Thank you.
It's okay.
Oh, yeah, Simon, yes.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. It was a very interesting talk. With regards to material hold in store that are more than 100 years old, so just to clarify, is that 100 years since the Tissue Act of 1906, presumably?
No, it's from the date of the person's death. So, for example, if somebody died this year, if you've got material in storage, for, sort of, how am I trying to explain it? It's just from the date of the person's death.
Right.
It basically means that from when the person's died, if there's more than 100 years that have lapsed, that you don't need sort of any license for storage or use of that material.
Okay, right, because obviously with archaeological and paleontological collections, you don't have to worry
Yes.
about that. But
No.
if you've got,
It's only if it's less than 100 years. So, you know, if you've got material in storage from, say, for example, 1924, but you're actually using that for a scheduled purpose, then you would need to be licensed. If you're storing it for no purpose, so it's not intended to be used for any of the scheduled purposes under the Act, so you're not planning to put it on public display, then, or you're not using it for any of the other purposes, such as research, for example, then a license isn't required.
okay, right, okay,
If it's over
right.
100 years old, you can
Okay, thank you.
use it. No worries.
So Sarah Alexander says, thank you for a very informative presentation. She's always found the HTA very helpful when they've needed advice, so that's nice.
Good, yeah, thank you.
So I'm sorry if I'm going to ruin your name, Gayatri. What does sensitive disposal involve? Is that factored into the consent?
Yeah, sort of when we talk about sensitive disposal, it can be quite difficult because under the a lot of establishments would choose for burial or cremation over sensitive disposal, which is usually by incineration. So when we talk about disposal, there's several options that sort of people can choose. So it can be a burial, it can be a cremation, it can be a sensitive incineration. However, a lot of the material that people have in their holdings is anonymous. And to be buried or cremated, you actually have to know who the person is. So it makes it very difficult under current legislation for a cremation to be held if the person is not known. They can't actually undertake that cremation because that's one of the things that has to happen. So when we talk about sensitive incineration, we talk about sort of establishments having agreements with sort of companies who provide incineration services. But what we ask for is that material is segregated from routine waste. So sort of your household waste, that it is packaged separately in some kind of sensitive receptacle. That there may be some establishments, for example, have agreements with the incineration providers that they incinerate material of human origin sort of on the first clean run cycle of the incinerators that are used. So whilst it's not the most sensitive option that people would like to choose, it is as sensitive as possible given, you know, sort of the material is not known.
Yeah, Rachel says thanks for that because that's quite yeah.
Yeah.
Because so on the Isle of Man, so I'm not aware of like the different ones across, but in the UK, but I know that obviously the hospital has the ability to incinerate, you know, human. Well, they're not remains because the person hasn't died, but you know, from certain.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone's
as long as they're doing the start of a clean run cycle, you can say, oh, can I put this before you start doing the rest of it, and we can do a separate little thing.
Yeah, so some establishments have got those agreements in place, which, you know, sort of it's as sensitive as it possibly can be.
Does anybody else have any questions? So Claire Cedric says, just to follow on from Simon's question, if we have material in storage that's less than 100 years with no scheduled use, so no license, do we need to ensure the records for this material are marked to indicate a license would be needed if the situation changes, such as we have a request for research.
Absolutely, that's a really, really good point. That's one of the things that we usually advise, especially sort of in our post-mortem sector, where families may have requested material to be retained but are not quite sure, you know, what they want to give sort of their consent for its use for. So if you've got material absolutely less than 100 years old, if you're not storing it with the intention for use, please do clearly mark it. If you use it for any of these purposes, which is research, education, training, and it's from the deceased, then please, you know, sort of mark it. Please discuss it with X person, and then you can obviously contact the Human Tissue Authority for advice and guidance on whether licensing will be required.
So we've got a couple of minutes left until the end of the session, and then we're going to have a break. So if anybody else has any questions, pop up. But one of the things that popped into my head when I was listening to your talk, so quite a few years ago now, and kind of frighteningly a longer time ago than it feels in my brain. So I went to the Body Worlds exhibition done by Professor von Hagens, and of course after that there was a lot of controversy in the press because it was people thought that perhaps he'd gained the bodies in an unethical way, and I guess that must have come through because I don't think he's not him and his company have not done many recent exhibitions and things like that. So yeah, what from your end, what kind of came out from that? What was what went on?
This was just before my time, if I'm being honest. I mean, I do know that obviously the exhibitions were licensed by the Human Tissue Authority, and there was one in London up until the pandemic, which I think then everything was deaccessioned. So that's no longer there now. And everything went back to the collection, so everything was exported back out. But they were licensed by the HTA, so would have had to have been compliant with our expectations and standards to have actually achieved being licensed for that purpose. So that's probably as much as I know, Laura.
Yeah,
if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Yeah, you've sparked memory. Yes, of course, it was on display until London until quite recently. I'd gone on the touring exhibition, but I think it was stationary for a bit. Anybody else? No? Anything popping up in the chat? Amy's put a link to the timetable again, just so that everyone knows when things are happening. We'll return from 11:25 for the next session. Thank you so much, Michelle. That was fascinating. I just do find your world incredibly interesting, and I love anatomy museums, and I think when things are done sensitively and correctly, they can be really educational.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we want to encourage is not people to be afraid of licensing and the Human Tissue Act, because, people have got, sometimes fabulous things in storage that they're too afraid to think about, can we actually put this on display, which may be really educational. So I'm happy to support if people want to think about that.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I mean, again, I'll reiterate the previous commenter. Yeah, I've always found it you guys really helpful whenever I've had any questions. So thank you, Michelle, much appreciated. We'll keep an eye on things in the meantime, but yes, we shall see you all back at 11:25. Bye, everybody.